Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Wellbeing of Women webinar, Menopause and Employment Law. We're just waiting for more people to join. So if you just bear with us and we will get started as soon as possible. Yeah, we'll get started, and then as more people join, they can catch up. We're just going to do some introductions. So my name's Zoe Irons, and I work for Wellbeing of Women. I'm the project manager for Menopause Xplored. This is the third in a series of webinars, and we'll exploring different aspects of menopause through the series. And I'd like to, this one is menopause and employment law. So I'm going to hand you over to my colleague Liz Cunningham, and she's going to talk for a bit more. Thank you.
Thanks, Zoe. Hello, I'm Liz Cunningham, and my business is Menopause Reality. Myself and Diane have been working with Wellbeing of Women for the last few years to deliver some in-person workshops around the menopause in the workplace for small businesses, and we're really pleased to be also now running this webinar series. Just to let you know the format today, we've got an hour for today's webinar. And we'll be taking questions for the last 10 to 15 minutes. So please do use the chat. Zoe and I will both keep an eye on the questions. And I'm sure that people will have a lot of questions for this one because it's often something that comes up in the sessions that we run. So I'm going to hand over to Diane to introduce herself. We're going to introduce Anne-Marie, and then we're going to start off with a few questions to look at the kind of the fundamentals of menopause as we get started. So Diane.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Liz. Good morning, everyone. I'm Diane Danzebrink. I'm the founder of Menopause Support and the Make Menopause Matter campaign, and also the author of Making Menopause Matter. And we're delighted today to welcome Anne-Marie Balfour as our expert, and I'm going to hand over to her now to introduce herself.
Oh, thanks so much. So I'm Anne-Marie Balfour. I'm a solicitor with Charles Russell Speeches in London. I've specialised in employment law for about 25 years, and within that I often advise employers and sometimes employees on menopause related matters. I've also been doing a little bit of work with Wellbeing of Women in relation to menopause. Delighted to have been invited to the chat today.
Fantastic. Thank you, Anne-Marie. So before we dive into the employment law side of things, it's probably worth pointing out that we have done the first webinar in this series. We talked for an hour about what menopause is, why it matters, and who it affects, everything in detail. But for anybody who's missed that, I think it's worth just kind of starting with a few sort of basic questions of why does menopause matter? And I'm going to put that to you, Diane. Why does menopause matter?
So menopause matters for a variety of reasons. Firstly, it will affect approximately half of the world's population directly. So that's just, you know, we've got around 8 billion people in the world. So it's going to affect just over half of those directly. But it will affect the other half indirectly, because there is nobody that's going to go through their life without knowing somebody who's going to experience menopause. So it's really important that we all have a basic understanding of that. We also know that we have more women than ever over the age of 50 in the workplace. That's without all of those who will go into perimenopause, early menopause, surgical menopause, medically induced menopause, premature menopause, who are under the age of 50. We also have an awful lot of those. But statistics show us that we've got more women over the age of 50 in the workplace than we've ever had, and it's one of the fastest growing demographics. It's also important to recognise that menopause it's very diverse. As you've just heard, there are an awful lot of ways that people can experience menopause. So we need to be aware of that too. And the fact that menopause can affect mental health and well-being, it can affect physical health, it can affect us in the workplace, in our relationships, our finances. So there's an awful lot of things to take into account. But ultimately, if those who are going to experience menopause have the right information prior to it coming along, it helps them to better navigate that. And it allows those who are going to be in a supporting role to support more effectively if they have the right information too.
Okay, and you listed off a whole range of different kind of types of menopause, if you like, in that introduction. But just to clarify, can we go back to basics for a second? And what is menopause?
So menopause. So let's look at what most people will experience. So the meaning of the word menopause means, if you translate it, the total cessation of periods. But that happens for different people at different times. So for the vast majority, they will experience what you might hear termed a natural or a spontaneous menopause. So essentially, this is where somebody will go through perimenopause, they will then get to menopause, and they will then be postmenopausal. So perimenopause, that means around the time of menopause, and that's a little bit misleading in itself, because perimenopause can last for several years for most people. So perimenopause begins essentially when the ovaries get to a critical level of eggs or oocytes. So every female is born with a complement of oocytes in their ovaries. As that gets to a critical level, what happens is the hormone levels that fluctuate on a monthly basis, they're not fluctuating in that way. They start to become more erratic. So that's your estrogen and progesterone. As those hormones start to fluctuate, around 3 out of 4 will start to experience some symptoms in perimenopause. And for many, perimenopause can begin in their late 30s, early 40s. There are varying suggestions for how long the menopause transition takes. In some journals, you will read 4 to 8 years. In others, you will read as long as 10. For others, it can be shorter. But for an example would be somebody who begins their perimenopause at perhaps 41, 42. The vast majority, they will experience menopause, which is a clinical diagnosis, which means that you've had 12 months without a period. So it's a retrospective diagnosis. For most, they experience that around their early 50s. And then you're postmenopausal. So that's all of the years that you live after you have experienced perimenopause and menopause. So that's a natural or spontaneous menopause. But it's also important to remember that that can happen earlier, depending on what part of the world you live in. It can also be premature. So for those who experience a premature menopause, that's menopause under the age of 40. It can be medically induced. So that's where somebody is having medical treatment which has an effect on their ovarian function. And that can suppress the ovarian function or damage the ovarian function. And that can put somebody into a medical menopause. Equally, somebody might be having medical treatment for another medical diagnosis which suppresses ovarian function. You can have those who go into an early menopause. So early menopause is under the age of 45. And you can also have somebody who experiences surgical menopause, and that's when both of the ovaries are removed at the same time, and that's clinically called a bilateral oophorectomy. So the type of menopause can be very different for each individual.
So the type of menopause can be different, and how that person experiences it, as you've said, the experience can be very diverse. I'm also aware that the range of symptoms can be very diverse, but I wondered if before we start, before we turn to Anne-Marie and start talking about the legal side of things, could you broadly give us just an overview of the different types of symptoms that people can typically experience with menopause?
Yeah, so symptoms fall into three categories. So you've got physical, cognitive, and psychological. So in the physical category, many people have heard of hot flushes and night sweats, and they're aware that at some point periods will stop. But it's also important to say that periods can become quite erratic. I think for a lot of people, they think that periods become very light, but actually for some people, unfortunately, they can become very heavy. And then you've got things like perhaps palpitations, achy joints and muscles, dry eyes, dry mouth, dry skin. There's a lot of other physical symptoms, including what clinicians call the genitourinary symptoms of menopause. So these are things like increased urinary frequency or urgency, increased urinary tract infections, or vulval and vaginal symptoms. And those things might not necessarily sort of flag up as, well, they could affect somebody in the workplace. But a decade of working with women in this space, I can absolutely assure you that for some people, they absolutely do. The cognitive symptoms, so you'll often hear them termed as brain fog, and we're really talking about things like changes to memory and concentration, again, can be absolutely critical in the workplace. And then things like the emotional symptoms, the psychological symptoms. So things like increased levels of anxiety, which is very common in perimenopause, low mood fluctuation, even for some people experiencing loss of confidence. So they can be very wide ranging.
And with that in mind, that they can be so wide ranging, can I just ask, this could sound quite provocative because obviously it's kind of self-evident, but why are we talking about menopause in the workplace specifically? How does this relate to the workplace?
Well, as I said, we know that we have more women in the workplace than we have ever had. So it's really key that employers retain that talent. And it's really key for those individuals that they continue in those jobs and careers that, sort of, for many people, it's something that they absolutely, for the majority, it's something that they need to do. But for many people, they absolutely love what they do too. So it is, I always say, you can't support something you don't understand.
Yeah.
So this is why we need for everybody, whether you're going to be someone who experiences menopause directly or whether you're going to be somebody supporting, you might be a partner, a friend, a family member, a colleague, you might be an employer. It's absolutely vital that we all have a basic understanding so that we can offer that support in the right way, individualized to each person, and feel confident that we can offer that support in the right way.
So let's have a look then a little bit more at the legal side of this. So Anne-Marie, could you start by giving us a bit of an introduction to the legal position in terms of the support that Diane's talking about, the legal position regarding the menopause in the workplace from the perspective of both employers and employees?
Absolutely, yes, thanks. So I think the law relating to employers and to employees is probably, they're probably two sides of the same coin, so I'll cover both together. But in summary, there aren't any menopause specific laws. It's not specifically mentioned anywhere in the laws, so that's my bit done. No, it isn't really. So there's been some hard lobbying in recent years, and so the conversation's very much been started. But at the moment, there's nothing sort of comparable with laws to protect pregnant people, for example. But we've got the new Employment Rights Bill, so that's not a law; it's a proposed law at the minute, and that does have a mention of menopause in it. It's requiring larger employers to produce something called equality action plans, and those are going to have to include information on the steps an employer is taking to support people going through the menopause at work. So not law yet, but quite likely to become that as part of the new Employment Rights Bill. A quick look at things that have been proposed as ideas for menopause related laws but have been declined so far. One is again similar to pregnancy, menopause leave, and that was turned down as a suggestion for a new law. One of the reasons for that, I understand, was that it might actually make it harder for women to continue in work after a period of menopause leave. And another suggestion was to add menopause as a protected characteristic. So the law, we'll look in a moment, the law has various protected characteristics, and one idea was to add menopause to the list of those. That wasn't agreed. One of the concerns, I understand, was that it might discriminate against men with long-term health conditions. So there's nothing specific at the moment, but that's not to say that people who are experiencing menopause aren't protected at all at work.
Okay.
And we've got a variety of existing laws that can be and are used by people who've had this kind of difficulties. Firstly, we've got just the ordinary law of unfair dismissal, so an employee with 2 years service if they're dismissed, where the reason for the dismissal relates to menopause. It might sometimes be that if that's been unfair, it could be an unfair dismissal, and there would be grounds for a claim there. There's also just the general health and safety law that applies to all employers, and with that, for example, looking after an employee's working conditions. So in a menopause context, that could be, I don't know, say working temperatures, and that would feed into the wider obligation to conduct risk assessments for an employee's role. And so menopause related matters would feed into that. And then the main law that's used to support employees is the Equality Act 2010, and that's the piece of legislation that we have which covers discrimination. It sort of drew together all of the various strands of discrimination law that we previously had, so age, sex, disability, and in a menopause context, the protected characteristics or types of discrimination that are particularly relevant are age discrimination, sex discrimination, disability discrimination, and also gender reassignment can sometimes be used as well. So while we haven't actually got menopause as a protected characteristic, obviously menopause doesn't always, as we just heard from Diane, but often will affect women, so the sex discrimination cited there. Age-wise, it's often a particular age bracket affected, and that can be any age. So English age discrimination laws, it doesn't matter. It can be an older age, a younger age, anything in between. So it's not like other jurisdictions where you've got to be over a particular age. It just needs to be age related, whatever that age might be. Worth bearing in mind for making sure the younger employees aren't then discriminated against because the older ones are getting something to support them. But turning to disability discrimination then, so someone who's experiencing menopause symptoms isn't always going to meet the statutory test for a disability. Far from it. Some people won't get anywhere near it, but others very much will, where their symptoms are severe. So if we look quickly at that test, because that might be quite helpful, to be a statutory disability, it needs to be So the employee needs to have an impairment, and that can be mental or it can be physical. Has a substantial adverse effect on day-to-day activities, so more than trivial. And it needs to have, it needs to meet what I like to call the longevity requirement, so have lasted or be expected to last for more than a year. So I think everything that Diane was talking us through earlier, you can see that actually all of those, you could tick the boxes for all of them, not always, but sometimes. And that can be not necessarily each individual symptom. It can be when you draw them together as a whole, it meets that test. So so for some employees, that protection's going to be there.
Can I just ask, are there any requirements on an employer with regards to menopause about with the law as it stands at the moment, and the different laws that kind of affect people going through the menopause in the workplace? Are there any specific things that an employer should have in place according to the requirements that are placed on them at the moment?
So there's nothing that says if you have an employee experiencing the menopause, you must do this.
Okay.
But what we do have under discrimination law is the duty to make reasonable adjustments, and that's triggered in exactly the same way as it might be for any other disability. So so if the employee does meet that test for a disability, and the employer has knowledge, then that will trigger the duty to make reasonable adjustments, just as for any other disability. And that can sometimes be quite an onerous obligation on an employer. What the adjustments are going to depend, they're very, very fact specific, just because everybody's symptoms are different, and it will depend on what role they do. So yes, I think, and it's a very important consideration. Because
so can I just ask you, Diane, because you've with the experience of supporting many women over the last 10 years to stay in the workplace when they may be struggling with certain elements of their menopause experience. Could you share some examples with us about the reasonable adjustments? Possibly some good examples of where they've been made successfully.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think much of this comes down to when it's successful. I think much of it comes down to certainly the women that I've supported feeling that there is a culture within their organisation where they can seek support. And I think where it goes wrong is where that culture doesn't exist. And that's not an easy thing to build overnight. But where it is successful, and sometimes, people need support to be able to do this. They need to be able to talk it through first with somebody outside of the organisation, which is, very often what I'm doing. But for instance, I can remember working with lots of people where it's been cognitive issues. It's been things around, particularly around concentration. So it's not so much around memory, but more around concentration. So perhaps being in a busy working environment, so a busy office environment where usually, it wouldn't bother them in the slightest. They can get on with their work, but actually perimenopause comes along and one of their symptoms is that they're struggling with concentration. And that is the symptom itself, or it could be that they have other symptoms going on, which means that they are finding it more difficult to concentrate because those things are distracting them. And one of the things where it is concentration itself, that is a direct symptom, I can think of two things that have helped lots of people. And one is being able to have a conversation with their line manager around whether or not, for a temporary period of time, they could work in a quieter environment. So sometimes that is literally just finding, now this obviously depends on the size of the organisation and the available space. But where it is an organisation where there is available space, actually just allowing somebody to have a quieter space to work in can make a huge difference to them. Alternatively, I've certainly worked with people where they have said, where there hasn't been that opportunity to work within a quieter space within the organisation. So they've been given the opportunity to work from home more regularly, and that's really helped them. Obviously, where concentration is a secondary symptom in terms of they've got lots of other things going on, actually, A, being able to talk about it, and B, being given the opportunity to attend appointments to get the help that they need to manage those symptoms has also made a huge difference. But very often it comes down to the simple things of being able to talk and being able to have that conversation ongoing and knowing that you're understood, validated and supported. Where it's more physical symptoms, I know you've heard this before when we've done our in-person sessions, but things like when it's things like particularly hot flushes, if somebody is having to travel on packed transport at particular hours of the day, that can be very stressful for them. And I know I've mentioned before that I did work with one individual, and for her, she had a situation where she almost fainted on a packed tube train, and that essentially was her moment for getting in touch and saying, I don't think I've got any choice but to leave. Actually, her employer was absolutely fantastic and said, well, we'll just change your working day times temporarily so that you don't have to travel during those times. And if there are days when you can work from home, let's agree that you can do that. I mentioned those genitourinary symptoms and said, sort of how they can affect people. If you're very worried about whether or not you're going to have erratic bleeding, if you're having to visit the toilets very often because you're experiencing urinary frequency or urgency, that can be difficult enough in an environment like an office environment. And we've seen people, move where they work to be closer to the toilets, etc. We've seen lockers put in so that people can keep, sort of what they need, clothing, sanitary products, etc., in lockers near the toilets. But if you're not in that situation, if you're in a situation where perhaps you are a teacher in a school, or you're a nurse, or you're a police officer on the beat, that's very different. So then you have to think about, okay, how can I best support that individual for, if it is symptoms like those genitourinary symptoms, how do we do that? And certainly this is not something that all schools can do, and it's not something that I've seen offered in every case, but I have seen in certain situations where teachers are able to call on another member of staff to come into the room so that they can leave the room if they feel that they need to, because there can be nothing worse than if you know that you have to leave the room urgently. A, you can't concentrate on what you're trying to do, and B, that must give you incredible anxiety.
Absolutely. And Anne-Marie, in terms of the kind of the responsibilities here, the reasonable adjustments that Diane's been describing, what is the responsibility of the employer when it comes to this? Do they have to proactively make employees aware that there's an opportunity to do this, or is this something that needs to be outlined somewhere in a policy document or something like that? Where's the onus?
Sure. So the duty is triggered as soon as the employer has knowledge of a disability.
Okay.
In terms of policies, they're not obliged to have one, but if you have one, then of course that you're well on the way to the conversation has been started. Mm-hmm. The signposting is there, people know who to come to, and their inquiries or their requests, or them just saying I'm struggling, should arrive at the right person much more readily than if they hadn't been able to look at a policy first. So I think, legal wise, then it's a matter of, okay, this person's disabled, we need to make reasonable adjustments. What might those be? But I think taking a step back from that, most of the time, it's going to be, a reasonable person talking to another reasonable person, all pulling in the same direction to solve it. So, I don't want to give the impression that this always becomes some horrible legal polarized situation. But when there is a problem, either, for whatever reason it's more complicated, or if with the best will in the world the changes that are needed just can't be made, then looking at it sort of purely funneling it into legals, then the employer first thinks, okay, is this actually a statutory disability? If it is, okay, what are the adjustments? And it's not an obligation to make all adjustments or everything that's been suggested, whether that's suggested by the individual or those who are advising or treating them. It's only reasonable adjustment. So it's always in that name, reasonable adjustment. So it's really testing yourself as an employer. Is it reasonable, and why is, if not, why is it unreasonable, and chatting it through. So it only has to be made if it's reasonable. And then if for whatever reason that adjustment can't be made, then thinking, okay, well, that won't work, but what else might work instead? Is there something similar, or can we offer anything else?
Yeah, so because I guess people may come across those situations depending on the kind of the working environment of the job. So Diane mentioned teaching with a suggestion of something that might work in a teaching role. But we have also come across in our in-person sessions that we've run people, for example, who work in more non-typical working environments, such as one that comes to mind is people who worked in a forest, and their job was part of their job was to physically maintain the forest, and the access to toilet facilities being one issue there, where they couldn't be provided with toilet facilities near to where they work. In a situation like that, what's the kind of the way forward from a legal perspective?
So after listening to the employee who is really the expert in how they feel and what might help them, something that can be really, really helpful is a referral to occupational health. And that's something that employers very often do. The better the letter of instruction to the occupational health practitioner, the better the report will be to give you the advice you need. So they can meet with the employee to understand it, and then as well as listening to things the employee can think of, they should be able to make some suggestions for the employer to consider as well.
This is just a question then for either of you. If this is a small business and it might be the first time that they've encountered something like this, where's the best signpost to send them to kind of initiate that occupational health referral if they've never encountered anything like this before?
I think that there are lots of providers for that, but I think that there's and normally they might have an employment lawyer they speak to on other matters, and they would be a good place to start too. Or as well as that, ACAS has some good materials online. Also, the Equality and Human Rights Commission has published some things as well. So
fantastic. We'll include those links in the follow-up to this webinar then, so that people know where to go. Diane, can you think of, thinking of these challenges around the reasonable adjustments, can you think of any examples where people have not been able to make those changes that they've needed, and then what happened next for them?
So I mean, my experience of this has been very much from supporting the individual, because the other side of what I do is, training for businesses and organisations. So very often I'm going in to give that initial information that they need to understand menopause in as you said, all its diversity. But unfortunately, there is no doubt about it that we do see a significant number of women leaving the workplace when they are not getting so there are two things that they're potentially not getting. One is they're not getting the right help and support in the workplace, but they might also not be getting the right help and support from their medical health provider. And those two things together, so if you're not getting the right help and support in either case, very often, we support quite a significant community of around 35,000. And we have seen some really shocking stats over the years of people who have, some of them who've not been aware. So this is probably going back, sort of the last into, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 years ago. Some people just not being aware of what was going on for them and feeling that they couldn't cope. And so ultimately they left jobs. And it's really tragic because when you talk to those people and you hear how much they loved what they did, there are people who I sort of always particularly think about the teachers, the healthcare professionals that I've spoken to who have left their profession, the police officers, etc., who have just felt that they had no option but to leave. And then, of course, you have the other situation where you have people who they do know what's going on for them. They may or may not have been able to get the right help from their healthcare professional to help to manage their symptoms, or they may have managed their symptoms in other ways, but then they do approach their employer and their employer is unhelpful, and doesn't recognise that actually menopause can have significant effects on somebody's health and well-being. And again, this is why I come back to, this should all be about everybody having a basic understanding, because I'm not excusing the fact that, people are unhelpful, but I think if you don't understand just how debilitating it can be for some people, so we know that around 3 out of 4 will experience symptoms. We know that approximately 1 in 4 will describe their symptoms as debilitating and significantly affecting their quality of life. And then when you look at the amount of women who leave the workplace, then we know that we've got a real problem that needs to be addressed.
And does this tie in, Anne-Marie, with there seems to be some quite high-profile employment tribunals about that relate to menopause in the media at the moment, and I guess that's the result of essentially not being able to overcome challenges or support not being provided in the workplace. But I wondered if you could share a little bit about that. Are there any common themes? What are we learning from these?
For sure. So that's exactly right. The employment tribunals are the place to go if an employee hasn't been able to resolve a menopause-related claim. So there's unfair dismissal claims, discrimination claims are brought in the employment tribunal. And they are, I think the figures for 2021, which were the latest ones I could find, say that claims that are citing menopause are up 44%. So that's quite a lot. So the claim, despite there not being a specific law, they're on the rise. I think the reasons for those are, I think, partly just the growing demographic of people experiencing menopause being in work, but also I think it's just that brighter and brighter media spotlight on menopause. There's just such better awareness, whether that's among employees, the public generally, also practitioners.
What before we sort of go on to our next section, which is looking beyond the legal requirements. There was one other area of challenges that I wanted to ask you about, which is the there's a lot of information being gathered here or being shared when we talk about menopause. And does this create considerations for the employer about data protection, and what should they be thinking about?
Yeah, it's a really good point. So the this health information is a special category of data under data protection GDPR law, and it's the one that's given. So the special categories get the highest level of protection. So I don't want to open the can of worms that is GDPR, but in summary, it means that when you're storing it, when you're sharing that information, it needs that highest level of protection and under policies, and always something to keep in mind when dealing with it. Linked to that, there's something else where you're getting medical reports as well. There's something called the AMRA, or the Access to Medical Reports Act 1988. And that has certain requirements about getting employee consent to reports and having an opportunity to have a quick look at the report. And it's not particularly onerous, but it's more an admin process, but it's really important that's followed too. It's the Access to Medical Reports Act.
Okay, so we've kind of covered quite a lot of considerations. We've talked about the requirements on the employer to think about reasonable adjustments, the kind of increase in tribunals reaching the media, and some data protection requirements. What would be really great before we go on to the questions that have been submitted is, can I ask you, Anne-Marie, in terms of the employer, what are the benefits to them of going beyond the kind of basic legal requirements when it comes to providing support for the menopause in the workplace?
Sure. So firstly, there are commercial benefits. So just like an employer might pay more than the minimum wage, which often they do, or pay enhanced maternity pay, there's that the benefit of an enhanced reputation, improving recruitment and retention and productivity. So those are the commercial side of things. In terms of more legal things, I think an employer who's going beyond the minimum and having a policy and putting in place support and raising awareness in their particular workplace, it's far less likely that the problems will arise in the first place. I think it's a rare manager now who isn't aware that pregnancy is protected, and there are things they need to keep in mind. I think that's less true for managers knowing about menopause. So having a policy and taking those steps that are above and beyond are far more likely to stop the problems arising or solving the problems early. I think if, perish the thought, a matter does end up in tribunal, then an employer who's taken those steps and can show that they are menopause friendly is always going to present much more favourably in the judge's eyes than one who hasn't. And then I guess if we've got if the Employment Rights Bill is going to be enacted, then employers are going to, the larger ones anyway, are going to have to say what they're doing to support menopause. So why not have something to say?
Absolutely. Diane, I wondered if you've got any thoughts to add on that in terms of the sort of the benefits to an employer's culture on going beyond the legal requirements, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is part of embedding that culture, isn't it? And, knowing for the employee, knowing that you are working for an employer who cares, cares about your well-being. And that's a powerful thing. Knowing that you are cared for as an individual, so not as somebody experiencing menopause, but as an individual experiencing menopause, that somebody is taking the time not just to educate their workforce, they've taken the time to educate themselves. You have, and that doesn't matter how big the organisation is. I mean, there is so much free information out there now and so many free resources that there really is no excuse not to have a very basic understanding of menopause. So I think, sort of the reason for going above and beyond is that ultimately you're much more likely to retain that member of staff. And if you have a member of staff that you want on your team, then it is worth your while to do those things. But I always like to think that on a human level, we want to do it because we care about each other. It's not just because of the bottom line. So, I'd like to think that, as time goes on, we will be doing this much more because actually we care about each other as human beings than we do because we're trying to protect our bottom line. And there are all sorts of free things that can happen. One thing I did just want to mention, it's certainly been my experience that I've worked with a lot of women, particularly over the last 5 years, where I've asked them, does your business, does your employer have a policy or guidance? And many of them will say they don't know, which means that if there is one, then the team should be aware of it. But the other thing I would say about policy is I've also worked with a lot of people where they've told me there is a policy, but actually in practice it's made no difference to me. So having a policy without education and awareness and without making sure that everybody within your team knows what part they play in implementing that policy is ultimately just a tick box exercise. And again, that all comes back to culture.
Definitely. I'm just going to use that point, that moment to throw forward and pre-promote our next webinar, because that's what we're going to be talking about in much more detail in terms of sharing some experiences around improving the culture of support for menopause in the workplace. So please do join us for that as well. I'm going to go to the questions now. So bear with me, Diane and Anne-Marie, because I don't know if you've had a chance to read them as they're coming in, but these might hit you a bit out of the blue. This is a nice, straightforward one, I hope, to start with, from Deborah Clark. And she asks, do we know yet what might be needed in a menopause action plan if the new employee rights bill does get agreed? That's a question for you, I think, Anne-Marie.
Absolutely, yeah, and a good one. The quick answer is we don't know yet, but it's for definite. There's sort of nothing prescriptive, but it's all those things that would look good. So we have a policy. We don't just leave it in the sort of intranet dark corner of the equivalent of a drawer, we used to say. We implement it. We have this kind of training, whatever training there is. If there are events focusing on menopause, perhaps if you want to, everyone to, Diane mentioned the lady who didn't know if there was a policy or not. If that were instead something, there'd been a launch event and then it was part of the adoption process, then those are things employers can do. So saying so that there is a policy, what they're doing to make people aware of it, any training that's provided. If there's any roles being created, for example, menopause ambassadors, or anyone who's been given particular training as a manager to deal with these issues, any of those kind of things, any sort of icebreaker events that are going on, and even being careful around confidentiality. If actually there are some sort of case study type things within the organisation, if you can showcase those without giving away anyone's sort of confidential information, then that would be a really nice way to show what you're doing too. So I expect it will be things like that, but we'll have to wait and see what further information we get.
Okay, thank you for that, Anne-Marie. There's been a couple of questions, and I'm going to sort of blend a couple of these together, so bear with me a second. And they kind of fall under the area around clarifying and diagnosis, and then the responsibilities for the employer. And I guess that some people have got a question about how a diagnosis is made, and then how that is and whether or not that is then classed as a disability. And I think that there's generally some questions here that are asking how is this recorded? What are the steps to getting to the point where, under the current framework that we're working to, with it being a disability, what is the legal responsibility for the employer to get to that point if there has not been a diagnosis of menopause?
So it's always going to be a double act between sort of the legal position and the medical underlying facts. So but ultimately whether somebody has a statutory disability is a legal question. So that's a question for somebody who's applying the law, albeit they're very much applying that law to the underlying medical information. So the more medical information, and the better the quality of that, the better. And then it would be, if it's not obvious to the employer to follow the test, then they could get legal advice, and it will be a question for a lawyer to apply that and say, is the test is for a disability met or not. Similarly with that, then whether an adjustment is reasonable or not. So you might have an occupational health practitioner who recommends a long list of things. They won't all necessarily be reasonable, and that's a legal test. So it's applying a legal test on top of medical. I don't know if that's probably answered the question.
Yes, I think there's a few questions, and there's a few people making points about how that employers shouldn't be. Deborah Clark makes the point that employers shouldn't be specifically driven by a diagnosis and focus more on helping the individual with their symptoms. Did you have anything else to add to that, Diane, in terms of the kind of, it is something we often get asked when we're in our face-to-face sessions. Often people would like some sort of formal checklist of going, how do I know if I am, at what stage I am? Am I perimenopausal? Am I menopausal? And I guess that can be quite difficult to manage.
Yeah, it absolutely can be difficult to manage. I mean, I think for the individual, often the light bulb moment for them is actually looking at a symptom checker and recognizing that all of the random things that they're experiencing actually could be related to perimenopause. I think in terms of, certainly when I work with women who are looking to have a conversation with their employer, I will often say to them, think about, don't focus on that list of symptoms. Think about what are the biggest challenges to you in the workplace as a result of what you're experiencing. So when you go to speak with probably your line manager or a member of the team in HR, when you sit down to have that conversation, before you have a think about it and think, what are the biggest challenges for me right now? And what could the potential solutions be? So what could be those reasonable adjustments? Because it's really helpful to have those in mind. And it also really helps the individual that you're talking to, because they might be very knowledgeable about menopause, but they might not. So it really helps them to understand, well, for this particular individual who is experiencing this, that is resulting in these challenges, they feel that these are the potential solutions that could help them. And that really helps the line manager or other individual that they're talking to then be able to consider those, go away to speak to, perhaps their manager, and think about what package they can put in place for that individual.
Thank you. I'm going to, there's a question from Lisa Hodgson, and I think that this is probably a good question to consider. She asks, we record sickness levels for back issues or D&V. I'm not sure what D&V is. Anybody want to take a guess at what D&V is? But I think broadly, she's talking about we record sickness levels and we record the reason for the sickness for various things, but not specifically for menopause. And I wondered, is it worth looking at the pros and cons of doing that? Because I presume that that is something that is decided at an employer level, whether they would record sickness levels in terms of the cause for the sickness.
Yes, that's exactly right. So that would be an employer level. I think D&V, I think, might be diarrhea and vomiting in a sort of sickness absence context. I think that's what sometimes goes on the footnotes. But I think it really depends. What are you going to do with that information? So there needs to be a good reason for processing information like that. If it's going to a good reason perhaps could be that it would be enlightening that there might be more we can do to support these people and reduce the levels of absence. But obviously lots of care around confidentiality, and it may well be that many people aren't actually going to say that's the reason why I was off today. I might not want to. So I think it might not necessarily be accurate, but I think that's probably my thoughts.
And is that something that might be included in the action plan, or is that kind of level likely to stay at an employer level, do you think?
Yeah, I think not necessarily the sort of raw data, but if it is an initiative that that there's a reason for it and has been acted upon in a positive way, and you can show that that's something that supports, is something you're doing to support people in the workplace, then absolutely it would. But I think it will sort of depend on why that's happening, what it's being used for, and in what ways that supports employees.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, Diane, I'm going to ask you this question. It's oh, hang on, we've just come in with somebody's just come in with quite a long question. I'll read that in a second. I was going to pick up on a question which I've now lost, so I can't say who asked it, but it was about the focus on menopause support policies by an employer can sometimes focus on older women. And one of the question poser asked whether employers should look at putting policies and support networks in place for all things female health related, perhaps a periods policy, etc. I wondered what your thoughts are on that, on the benefits of doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the benefits are everything that we've spoken about in terms of, sort of employees feeling as though they are truly valued, that they're heard, that their experience is validated, and that they're supported. So, I don't think there's any negative to any of that. One of the things that I would say in terms of menstrual health and menopause is there is a great document, the British Standards Institute document, which was produced, oh gosh, it's probably a couple of years ago now, but it is a very thorough document. So for any employer who doesn't currently have any guidance, it's actually a really good template to take your guidance from, because it is such a thorough document. And I think with what you say about, sort of menopause perhaps being focused on older women, I think that also speaks to perhaps the lack of education and awareness around the diversity of experience of menopause. And we know that there are a significant number of women who will experience a surgical, medically induced early or premature menopause, and that absolutely has to be taken into account.
I'm going to ask you to answer this very quickly in 1 minute, Anne-Marie, because there's a question about if people are not recording menopause as the cause of sickness and different symptoms are presenting as different causes for sickness, where do they stand in terms of the legal position with regards to sickness leave when there become multiple episodes? Is there a quick answer to that?
It's more a sort of I don't think it's any different from any other sickness absence. So just normal sickness absence laws apply, and it will always depend from employer to employer on what their policy is.
Okay, we might try and come back and cover that a little bit further in a future one. If anyone, I've found the question now. It's Audra, and Audra, if you want to join us in the next webinar, I might try and come back to that one with a little bit more time. But thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to pass back to Zoe to just wrap up for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Hope that was really useful. Thank you for all of your questions, all of your comments and suggestions as well. It's been amazing. Our next session is on February the 13th, again at 12 o'clock. There will be a follow-up email that will come out to you in the next couple of days. It'll have various links in. It'll have the link to sign up for that webinar as well, but it is on Eventbrite. And then if anyone's got any questions, you'll have my contact details as well. So please feel free to reach out directly to me. Thank you.
Thank you.